Hello, this is Robert Rickover. I'm an Alexander Technique teacher living in Lincoln, Nebraska. I teach regularly in Toronto, Canada, and I teach online these days. My guest today is Penelope Easton, who studied, she's an Alexander Technique teacher in County Clare, Ireland. She studied zoology at Cambridge, then trained in the Alexander technique, and then worked for Margaret Goldie, who's usually thought of as Miss Goldie, for 4 years after her training. And that experience set her on a 30-year journey to understand the difference between what Miss Goldie was teaching and what other teachers were doing and what is the science behind what she's doing. She's recently written a book, which you could hold up right now for our audience because it just came out. Wow. And I'm waiting for my copy. Her book is titled The Alexander Technique, 12 Fundamentals of Integrated Movement. And you can find out how to order it from her site. I'll be putting a link to her site by the interview. So that having been said, welcome to what will be a podcast. Right now it's a video.
Hello, Robert.
And I believe that today we've done this is the 6th one in a series about Margaret Goldie, Miss Goldie. And I believe today you're going to talk about her idea of, is it a strong back? Is that the phrase? Yeah. And I have to say, it's not a phrase that I've heard used a lot. I know some teachers do use it. Anyway, Penelope's going to talk about that today. So maybe you could start by telling our viewers and listeners what is a strong back in this context?
Well, that's an interesting question in itself because my training course was with Misha Magadoff, who was McDonald, where one went in and out very sort of strongly out of chairs, and there was in and out of chairs, and there was a lot of emphasis on oppositions, and oppositions build strength. And my first term of training, I put on half a stone. That's what's that in kilos?
That's what I was going to ask for our American listeners.
7 pounds. Yes, we have to put it in all.
Yeah, it's what, about 7 pounds?
Yeah, 7 pounds, 3.5 kilos, half a stone, which is quite a lot when you're my build. Right. And at the same time, I mean, the scales were telling me that, and I was wondering where it was going because I was actually looking slimmer. And I realized it had gone on muscle on my back. And by the end of that training, you could see my back muscles, they rippled. And then I went to Miss Goldie. And she proceeded to berate me for being weak. And the first...
That's great. You gotta love Miss Goldie. Yeah.
What do you mean? I put on all this muscle. But there I was sitting in my beautiful upright way, like one does, with the legs apart and the hands on the knees, beautifully upright. And she found the fixing. I'm just going to demonstrate. Just sort of, she realized I was a bit fixed across here, and she collapsed it. And the next thing I knew, I was back in a slump. For the first time in 6 years, I was back in a slump, and it was like, what happened? And it was about 6 months before I could properly sit up again. And she just rebuilt my coordination and the integration of my muscles. Now, I couldn't name at that point what happened, but now I can name that what she did was she linked my legs and my back, and she brought in my core muscles. And during that time, she kept berating me. How come you're a teacher? You have such a weak back. You cannot possibly be a useful teacher with a back like that. You young teachers, you've all got weak backs. I don't see any strong backs. I'm not quite quoting her correctly, but that was the drift of it. And I've talked to other people, and they also got berated for having weak backs. And as for when I got pregnant, by God, I got an earful. What was I doing getting pregnant with a back like that? It just wasn't good enough. Um, anyway, my back did come strong with her. And when I finished the working with her, I then, as you know, went on this long journey to find out what happened. And it was after a while I discovered natural breathing and how to bring that expansion from the inside. If you just wait at the bottom of an out breath and wait, and you wait and you wait, the back actually opens and starts to. And I started to be able to access that strong back for myself from the inside. And at that point, I had a party trick, which I would use on workshops of getting people to put their hands on my back,
Mm-hmm.
and I'd push them over backwards. I could push them across the room by waking up the back muscles there. And it was a good party trick.
Mm-hmm.
But it's not just a party trick, it's about how one actually comes out of the chair in an integrated way. Because I think there are several ways, even within the Alexander world, of getting out of a chair.
Mm-hmm.
And one of them is the McDonald way, where you put your legs wide apart and then you just thrust straight up.
Mm-hmm.
Well, it's a bit of a cheat, really, because that's not how babies get up and down, is it? That one. I mean, it's a device I think Alexander was using, and there are pictures of him working with Miss Goldie like that, with the
Mm-hmm.
feet wide apart. That's something he was obviously doing for a while, and it obviously helps get things. It helps get the up current working, which is why I think MacDonald liked it so much, because for him going up was key because of that, spinal curvature that he had, and he had always to be working against. So that to get that up thrust straight between the heels and the top of the head for him was brilliant. So he always worked, I think, with his feet apart. But when I first moved to Sheffield, I thought, I can't work with little Sheffield ladies with their feet wide apart. I mean, it's just not on. It's possible among enlightened people in London who already eat muesli for breakfast. They'll take something like that, but not ladies who work in offices. I didn't feel it was okay, and I wanted to discover how to work with the feet parallel, which is, of course, how Goldie always worked. She never put the feet right out. She always worked with the feet under you,
Mm-hmm.
under the hips. Um, Now, the second way of getting in and out of a chair, which I would have done with my first teachers, who were Carrington trained teachers, is the tilt forwards and the up you come.
Mm-hmm.
And that involves a lovely free movement of the hips. And people think of that as, what's wrong with that? And it's lovely. It's a lovely free movement. But actually, when you find Goldie's way, it takes that movement but puts much more stability into it.
Mm-hmm.
And maybe the only thing to do is demonstrate, which is, if I just tip forwards from the hips, it's like that. Whereas
Mm-hmm.
if I think this, if I get it sort of, because she was always poking me here and here and here and here, and then when one gets that going, then actually, I don't know whether you can see, but there's this part of my back starts to work to start
Mm-hmm.
me lift me out of the chair. And there's an integration from the legs so that the legs just unfold and the back and also the head leading, of course, but the back actually lifts you out of the chair. And it's a very, very different kettle of fish,
Mm-hmm.
which then integrates the torso to a much, much greater level. And one of the interesting consequences of that for me was I could never throw in a straight line. If I had a dart in my hand, if we were playing darts, people would actually get well out of the way because my dart could go anywhere. It didn't even hit the board half the time. And throwing a stick for the dog, I mean, sometimes the blooming thing would go behind me. And when Goldie got this whole integration going on, she, suddenly, I could throw a ball for the stick. I could hit not merely the dartboard, I could hit a bullseye. It brought in a coordination and a strength together. And I think in the technique, we've become very afraid of the word strength. I don't know what your relationship with the word strength is, but I've noticed, if I try saying, gosh, we're building strength here, people go, whoa, hang on. We're not about strength because we have this sort of whole, tight version of strength. But that's not real strength. Real strength is this. It's a balance of forces.
Hmm.
And when you bring all the muscles into play together, rather than the bodybuilder's way is just to bring these ones into play at one, it's very much isolated muscles, isn't it? The fitness idea of strength is based on a few muscles working, but actually there's no integration in it.
Hmm.
And what Goldie did was integrate the whole blooming lot. And then when everything comes into play together, you get strength that just comes in like that.
Right. So the problem with the muscle buildup that you experienced on your training course, which sounds good, right?
Yeah,
Um, is that it wasn't really integrated with the rest of your system.
that's what I would think. That's what I now realize. Yes. I
Hmm.
didn't know it at the time, of course, but yes.
Okay. And did Miss Goldie help you achieve that integration with with her hands, and or were there also verbal instructions that went with that?
Well, the main verbal instruction was, of course, getting me out of the way. And one of the things that she picked up early on, um, again, I was used to sending directions, and on our training course, we were always think up, think up, think up, think up, think up. Well, that had to stop. It just got in her way. I was over directing in her book,
Hmm.
and to her, and I think this is incredibly important. She said directions have become primary in training schools. You send this up and you send those out and you send that back and you send, unless it's done from a place of quiet, you don't
Hmm.
get the integration. You've got to come to quiet first. So I had to stop using all my directions, and in fact, I didn't use them for quite a number of years at all. I just came to quiet and use things like the natural breathing, where again things just come into play by themselves. It's that whole stop doing the wrong thing and the right thing will do itself
Hmm.
idea that Alexander either did say or is supposed to have said. Um, so it's yes, she stopped me doing the directions, and in the lesson she was building tone with you. Whatever she did, your instruction was not to let it go, because she'd get my head going somewhere, and then the minute she took her hands away, I'd be likely to let it go again, because one does. No, you've got to keep that going, you've got to keep that going. And so she'd be like putting my ribs back, and no, you've got to keep that going. She'd have you over in a deep monkey, and tipping you here and tipping you here and tipping you here, and you could be standing there 10 or 15 minutes in this
Hmm.
monkey with her tapping you. And I think what she was doing was building up this integrated tone through the system, bringing the hips into play. And now I would be able to name the muscles. She was bringing the transverse abdominis into play, the obliques into play, the lats into play, as well as the deeper muscles, the psoas, the QLs. She was bringing all these muscles into play, and my role was not to let it go, was not to interfere, but not to let it go. And so she was building it, and then she'd move you, and you'd just go, and you'd just
Right.
fly. But of course, it didn't teach me how to do it for myself.
Well, let me just ask you a quick question. When you were describing she might work around your head neck area, and then she'd take her hands off and you would revert, and then she would say, no, it's your job to continue this. Isn't that continuing a kind of a direction?
Yes, the direction was, I mean, she never said head forwards and up. She would say not the head back.
Hmm.
So that was the direction. She would put my head forward and up, and my direction was then not the head back.
Hmm.
So
Well,
they were
not
more.
to head back's a pretty good direction.
Oh, it is absolutely, but it
Yeah,
was very different from the directions I'd learnt.
yeah.
They were different, I suppose, and they're sort of, are they? It's one of those moot points, isn't it? Is a direction like that a direction or an inhibition? It's because
Well,
it's
yes.
you know
And
it's where
actually,
it
that's
starts. Yeah.
something we're gonna do another interview after this one, and I believe that's something we will get into
Mm.
then in more detail, because I think that gets to the heart of some stuff that is kind of a new way of thinking for for Alexander teachers. Anyway, so anyway, she gave you what I guess we could call, using her hands and some verbal instruction, and you basically staying out of the way and letting what she was showing you manifest. She was giving you a kind of true strength, you might say, like strength to actually do something well, not bulging muscles necessarily, but an integrated a way to move in an integrated way that was actually quite strong, but not a bodybuilder kind of quite strong.
Yeah. Yeah,
Yeah.
there's no force in it. So there's no force.
Right.
And
Right.
again, I think if I can say this, I think that sometimes the McDonald work could sort of almost become force. It's sort of, thrust your heels down and send yourself up. And it
Mhm.
could be very dynamic, but it could almost tip over into sometimes into overdoing. I think if I can
Right. Yeah.
risk, I don't want to offend anybody here because I mean it's there's some fantastic work going there. But it and but it
Well, in
but
some
that's
ways, we're
what.
probably offending everybody, so it's no problem. We're equal opportunity offenders. Because these are not concepts that are really out there, I don't think, in
No,
most teachers. So, yeah.
no, and I think there's the integration that I saw in her between the back and the legs
Hmm.
was was amazing. There's a um, and I think a lot of us don't know how to ground properly because there isn't that integration. They're still slightly tipped forward. This is where it comes back to the Jando work, because it's through the Jando work, of course, the Jando Massawera work that we've
Hmm.
talked about in earlier podcasts, that
Hmm.
I really started to put the biomechanics to what Miss Goldie was doing with the strong back. And
Hmm.
again, to name it, I think she was bringing in there's a whole link between the thoracolumbar fascia, which is this,
Yep.
here, and then
Hmm.
round to the abdominals and the obliques at the front, and the psoas up in the middle, and you can bring the whole lot in together, and then you get a support at the base of the torso that very few people know how to action. Now, I think, again, you see, this is my theory that Alexander discovered this, maybe from Delsart, passed it on to Miss Goldie, very possibly passed it on to Mr. MacDonald and Mr. Carrington as well, but because it wasn't articulated and it wasn't, people didn't know how to pass it on. So I
Right.
think things got
And
lost.
there's a picture that you referenced in your original video, taken from a video of Alexander at his country estate, I assume, hosting a party for all of his trainees and others, quite a few people there. It's a fascinating video to watch for a lot of reasons, but you pulled out a still picture which showed pretty much all the assembled people, more or less sideways view of them. And I think your point was he and most of the others seemed to be doing what you just described, with the exception of AR, who, as you pointed out, seemed to be in a bit of a pushing his pelvis forward mode, which at the minute you said that, and I looked at old AR, he certainly was doing that. So maybe he didn't get that message, or maybe he got it later. Who
Or
knows?
maybe he was just having a lazy moment, who
Maybe
knows?
he just said, I'm just going to slouch because it's part of my flex. She parroting what Marge Barstow used to say, sometimes I just feel like a slouch.
Hmm.
It's just, and she would go into the most subtle slouch you could ever imagine, and said, then maybe I don't really want to stay here for that long, kind of thing. So yeah, he may have been in that mode, but it's pretty striking when you look at the photograph that you pulled out, and uh, that they were all standing in a quite a upright but easy upright way, is
Oh,
how I would
it's
describe it.
elegant, isn't it? I think,
Elegant, and yeah,
but yet strong. Yes.
right,
They've all got their hand. I mean, Marjorie Barstow is on the right hand side of that, and her hand is her arm is completely vertical and her palm facing back.
right,
Now, when Goldie first did that with me, I was shocked.
right. Well, there is a passage, I believe, in I don't know whether it's in MSI, I can't remember now, where Alexander gives he basically answers the question in his own way. How can you tell if someone has good use? And he offers this test, a sort of a universal use test. Observe someone when they're standing, not doing anything special. And if the palms of their hands are facing back, that means they've got excellent use. If they're facing sort of sideways a bit, that's your typical mismanaged person of today. And if they're forward, that's really bad. And it's a weird passage because, for a lot of reasons, one of which, you don't really see people walking around with their palms forward, except in anatomical drawings. And I think Alexander saw drawings of natives that were being produced and just assumed that's how they stood, and they were clearly. There are a lot of problems with that test. And also, of course, some people stand with their palms facing back and they don't have very good use. So it's a flawed test, but I think I've always thought there was an element in there of truth.
Mm.
Even I noticed when I was working with people and they were getting a little freer, typically their palms would rotate a bit towards
Yeah.
being back. Yeah, and I think and in that photograph we talked about, for sure, some of the people, was pretty clear that's how their hands, where their hands were pointing.
So, I mean, it is, the passage is in MSI. It's towards the end. It's
Yeah,
one, and it's I mean, if I just put myself so you can see me.
yep,
So if I let my body go back into a little bit of a tilt, and
yep.
you'd think that is beautifully upright, wouldn't you?
Well, it looks like you're holding. Yeah,
Yeah, a
yeah,
little bit. So I've just got a little bit of a tilt back here, and that immediate, and a little bit of an arch here, and a little bit of a bulge here. We say, let the tummy go. We don't hold
yeah,
our
yeah,
tummies in, but the arm has actually rotated slightly. The hand is facing towards it's sort of a 3/4. It's not fully forwards, but it's a sort of 3/4. This is actually forwards of the body.
hmm,
Now, if I get that strong back going, tap, 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 tap,
yeah,
tap, tap, tap. Now I've come into the use that we saw in those pictures,
right,
where everybody's back is a lot straighter. The shoulders are more forwards than the
yep,
body than you'd expect. The hand is now at the front of the rib cage, not at the back. And
uh-huh.
what's the hand?
The hand is rotated back. Yeah,
Yes, the
yeah,
arm has come straight, the hand has come back, and then the head comes just slightly forwards of the body,
hmm,
rather than being right over the body. So it's and then if you take that still further, of course, you go into the forward.
yeah,
And I like Nettlefoil and Vanier. Do you know their book?
yep. I haven't read
And
it recently, but yeah.
I haven't read the book, actually. I've
Oh,
read a summary of it in the ANSAT magazine. But they talk about the secondary curve and the primary curve. And
uh-huh.
somewhere in between is this neutral place. And I think, secondary rotates us out, primary rotates us in. And then
Right,
in the middle, that is actually where we should be. But
right,
very, very few people in our society are.
right. Yeah. Well, I
Most
think one
people
reason very few people are is because if if you're a kid and you're slumping, which a lot of kids do, say a teenager or pre-teenager, and your parent uh, says to you, stand up straight, you're gonna, and if you're in that slump, your shoulders are rotated forward quite a bit.
Yeah.
And if you then follow that instruction of standing up straight, then your shoulders are going to be pulled back, and they'll have gone through quite a big movement. And of course, now you're over straightening, but mom will be happy. And the when mom leaves, the kid can revert back to where they were, and it's no harm done, hopefully. But somewhere in the middle between those, which they have not had time to explore because they were just told to stand up straight, would be a pretty good way of being.
Yeah.
And you know who really talked about that particular thing a lot was Marjorie Barstow. She
Oh,
would
okay.
demonstrate it, and that came up quite often
Mm,
in her teaching.
yeah.
That's
Yeah.
where
And
I really
yeah.
got that.
And I think in that it's sort of simple way, I think every teacher would understand that you certainly, most of us, we were there when certainly I was there when I first came to the technique, and alternating it with here, but here hurts, so I'd go
Yeah,
back to here.
right,
And then
right.
we come back to somewhere we think is neutral, but it's actually probably slightly back.
Yes,
And
I would
when you
agree
actually,
with that. Yeah,
we think it's upright, but actually it's ever so slightly back. And
I
so
think that's correct.
further work,
Yeah,
this
yeah,
further work that I'm suggesting here, it's like
yeah.
we're 3/4 the way there, but there's another tweak, and actually that tweak makes all the difference in the world when you really get this lower body working from the deep inside, and you get these core muscles working, and you get the whole thing working, and the shoulders really come to where they're supposed to be. That just it's like it just brings in it coordinates and strengthens all in one go. And I have great fun when I was doing workshops here for the public and I called them Alexander Technique, Get Fit with Alexander Technique, because of the way this just brought in strength and coordination. And of course, I was getting middle-aged ladies. And the minute they found that coordination, they were able straight away to do things like planks, you know, not push-ups, because that actually requires strength, another different sort of strength in the arms. But they could do planks, and they'd even got the stability that they could even lift one arm. And they were gobsmacked because, they wouldn't have expected to be able to do something like that.
And how did you get them to get to that place? Can you describe that a little bit?
Sure. I mean, certainly 16 or 17 sessions. It wasn't done in 2 sessions.
Right.
But firstly, obviously, just learning to free the neck. But I would teach them how to breathe from this internal place. So they got this sense of letting the whole torso expand. And then I would work with these pulls that, I learned from Jando, but I felt from Miss Goldie of how to engage here and engage here and engage the sitting bone, the hamstrings, engage the back muscles here with this pull to the elbow, and things start and teaching them that way of also getting all happening in one go, so that you get this integration of tone through the system. We would work on walking, we'd work on bouncing, we'd work on going down on one knee and coming up again, just to start to build up that flexibility and mobility and strength, and every so often testing it. I'd get them just to stand up and say, lift one leg. This is one of my tests. And then say, okay, and that's pretty stable, and it goes to there, that's fine. And now let's bring in all that integration, and now let's do it again, and look how much higher the leg comes.
Yeah.
And there's even more stability there. So the sort of their little tests, and they loved that, because they could see they got stronger and more stable and more flexible all in one hit. And then so we'd just be building it up week by week by week. The book actually takes the same course. It's all in the book.
So if you get the book, you can start practicing on your own.
Yeah, you can work through it. Yeah,
Okay.
part one, you learn the inhibitory side, the breathing, and how to use your mind for it. Because you don't start in with that stronger stuff. You start in with the inhibitory stuff. That's
Right.
crucial. And the spatial awareness stuff. But in part two of the book, we work through all that. And actually, at the end of it, let me just find the page. There we have it. There's the plank.
Yeah.
and the
Excellent.
directions that are involved to do it. So it's all there in the book, and it's and you wouldn't associate Miss Goldie with doing a plank, but because she wouldn't have been into that sort of thing. But I'm quite sure that if I'd tried it, and I didn't try it at the time, but if I'd tried the plank while I was working with her, it would probably have been there. And
Yeah.
then, of course, I lost it with these illnesses and
Mhm.
life. And
Right.
it's
Right.
been it's this finding the musculature and but it's working precisely with anatomy, you see. And her
Mhm.
work was so precise. I think we sort of tweak an elbow, but she would tweak your elbow in exactly the right plane. And so it's the precision that draws these muscles into play. It's
Mhm.
the precision counts. And so I show all my pupils the anatomy drawings, and they go, "Oh, right, okay, that's good. Now I know what now I know what the body is trying to find." They're not going there with the mind, of course, because that would be too localized.
Mhm.
It's finding it from here, but the brain's got to understand. Because if we don't understand, how can we do it for ourselves? How can we give the brain enough information? Would you agree with that? We need to
Well,
understand.
yeah, my general take on how our minds direct our bodies and is that it's the prefrontal cortex that's doing the thinking, but definitely not doing the work. I mean,
Well,
it's
that's
like the supervisor
yeah,
comes up with ideas, but the actual doing of stuff is the rest of the system. It's
yeah,
kind of an outsourcer
yeah.
of
Brainstem and
yeah,
go down and yeah,
exactly, all of that stuff.
yeah.
Well, this might be a good place to. I think we've covered the basic question, right?
Yeah,
About
no,
what she meant by a strong back, and uh, so my guest today has been Penelope Easton. She's written a book, um, which she will hold up once again for our viewers to
sure.
see. And I'll put a link to her website by the interview, and you can learn how to order it there. Oh, so thank you for part 6.
Thank you, Robert.